two phases of gastric control here. There's a third one. It's on the next page. So, the first phase, cephalic phase, it's all in your mind. Literally, it's all in your mind. If you see food, hear food, smell food being prepared, your cerebral cortex becomes a stimulator of parasympathetic stimulation. It feeds that information, feeds an activation stimulus to the hypothalamus and the medulla, and that information goes out of vagus nerve, and now you're going to have gastric glands, salivary glands start to produce material for the arrival of food, because your brain thinks there's food coming down. That also is going to stimulate the production of gastrin from the endocrine cells in the stomach wall. Remember, the stomach's an endocrine organ. Okay, so let's move into the gastric phase. The gastric phase now, more gastrin hormone from those endocrine cells. They're called G cells. Now you have an increase in gastric motility, more gastric gland secretion. The food is already down there, and you get physical digestion, mixing, compressing of the stomach, lots of chemical digestion. All that is going on. Gastrin is also going to open up the valve, the pyloric valve, to help food move along into the small intestine, and to prepare, and of course everything is being prepared in the small intestine to continue this. Another factor here are baroreceptors. They're monitoring pressure. Baro means pressure. That also feeds information to the brain, obviously, about how much material there is in the stomach. All this is pretty well seen on that little graphic over here at the bottom right. Same thing there. Okay, so let's move along into the third phase. This is called the intestinal phase, exactly what it sounds like. And at this point, the chyme, because everything that came into your mouth, remember, you know, like a Baby Ruth bar or whatever, chocolate bar, nuts and, caramel, chocolate, stuff like that. By the time you eat it and saliva is added to it, it's now an indistinguishable brown putty-like material that you swallow. That's called a bolus. Gets down into the stomach, adds to gastric gland material, and that stuff now is the consistency of toothpaste, and it's called chyme. I'm going to now refer to it as chyme. So the chyme is now in the duodenum, first part of the small intestine, and now you want to reduce gastric secretions. You want stuff in the stomach to be reduced because the stuff in the small intestine has to pick up and be digested chemically now, and you don't want more stuff coming in from the stomach. So the stuff in the stomach is going to take a second page to what's going on in the small intestine. So there are a lot of hormones now that are involved in this. CCK and secretin both inhibit gastric motility. The stuff is sitting in the stomach until the stuff in the small intestine is taken care of. You're going to see CCK and secretin many times before we're finished here. They have multiple targets. They target the stomach, they target the pancreas, they target the liver, and CCK also targets gallbladder. There are other things that can control emptying of the stomach into the small intestine. If the food is fluid or solid, for example, a milkshake would go through quicker. The amount of chyme already in the intestine, that is how much you've already eaten previous to that. Are there any irritants in the intestine, in the food? You know, bacterial gastritis, intestinal inflammation, things like that. And if it's a high-fat type of food, like a hamburger, a steak, something like that. The reflex involved here in moving the food along from stomach into intestine is called the enterogastric reflex. Now, you'll notice there's a reference up here to vomiting. Alright, so if you ingest something that is an irritant, it's got bacterial byproducts that could be bad for you, they get down into your GI tract and they will induce vomiting to get the stuff out of there. That's obvious, kind of. In order for vomiting to occur, two things have to happen. One, the pyloric valve has to close, and two, the muscle of the stomach wall has to contract. If the pyloric valve is open, then the food will just go down instead of coming up. And you've got to have compression of the stomach, otherwise the food doesn't go anywhere. You can vomit accidentally, and you can vomit on purpose. So if a child ingests a poison, anything like that, you can give something called an emetic, which induces vomiting. The medical term for vomiting, by the way, is called emesis. Okay. We should talk about ulcers, although we're going to talk a little bit more about this in lecture. There is a bacterium that causes it. This has only been known for about 20 years. Thought that previous to that it was high stress or things that you ate or spicy foods, things like that. But it's now known that it is a bacterium. The organism likes high acidity, which makes sense since it's in the stomach. There are some predisposing factors. There can be a hereditary factor. It has to do also with the number of bacteria you've got in the stomach, and factors also related to the food that you're eating too. Now, they're called peptic ulcers because they have to do with pepsin. Now remember, ulcers are caused by pepsin enzyme breaking down the protein structure of the wall of the stomach, which you see over here. This is the actual breakdown of the stomach structure, which is mainly protein. This is really not so much HCl, but remember that HCl plays a factor because HCl activates pepsinogen to pepsin, which is the enzyme that's doing the digesting. You can have duodenal ulcers at the beginning of the duodenum. You can have gastric ulcers in the stomach. It's the same thing, though. And I think I already showed you some things that you can take. Proton inhibitors, they block the pumping of hydrogen from blood into the cells of the gastric wall, so they don't go into the hydrogen ions, don't go into the lumen, and they can't combine with chloride, and you don't get HCl. So here's a look at the bottom of some of the medications. Not important that you know that. You'll cover this in pharmacology anyway. Okay. And then there's some other things like histamine inhibitors and parasympathetic inhibitors like Tagamet is a parasympathetic inhibitor, so it reduces gastric gland secretion and you don't get as much pepsin. You can see this is multifactorial. There's a nice graphic here showing that. And you see a couple of ulcers down at the bottom. And on the bottom left, you see a bleeding ulcer. Remember that the mucosa has no blood supply to it. But if that ulceration destruction goes down into the submucosa, then you have a bleeding ulcer. Okay. One last thing before we leave this. Did want to point out GERDs. I've mentioned this before. Let me get back to this. Look at this picture right here, and you'll notice diaphragm right there. Now remember that normally the diaphragm is sitting over the top of the stomach, but what's happened here is the stomach, part of the stomach is pooched up through the hole in the diaphragm. There is a hole in the diaphragm. It's called the hiatus. And if the hiatus is too big or it gets stretched out of shape, the stomach will get pooched upward, and then you've got like a mini stomach above the regular stomach. And this causes indigestion, heartburn, blah, blah, blah. So you see this is related to reflux disease. It's called GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux. And remember also there's another factor. Let me get my bar down here again. There we go. Where was I going with this? Oh, remember that there is a little valve right here. It's not exactly a valve, it's really just a closure. It's called the gastroesophageal sphincter or cardiac valve. It's not a true valve, circular valve like the one down here, the pyloric sphincter. And treatments for GERD are very often things that decrease the lower esophageal pressure. So let's go on here. Okay, so we're going to move down to the small intestine, and you see the three parts: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And the major part is the longest part anyway, is the ileum. But one important thing to note is that the jejunum is where most of the chemical digestion is occurring. Now, the duodenum is short, and its claim to fame is that the material coming from the gallbladder, that is bile, and stuff, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, trying to see how to get out of that, and the stuff coming from the pancreas, pancreatic enzymes, all go into the duodenum. I'll show you that on a picture coming up. The small intestine is made of these uprisings right here. They look like finger-like things sticking up. They're called villi. One is called a villus. You see more of them back over here. It's the distinctive feature for the small intestine. In addition, the small intestine has got all of these ridges in it, like this, in addition to the microvilli that stick off the top. Those are the microvilli. But you can again see all these upwellings of the wall, and you see that right there. These are called plicae circularis. I mentioned that there is a duct coming in from the pancreas and a duct coming in from the gallbladder into the duodenum. You'll see that coming up. And there's a little valve that controls that entry point too. And at the other end of the small intestine is the ileocecal valve that controls the material going into the cecum from the ileum, which is the last portion of the small intestine. That's why it's called the ileocecal valve. Okay, so what you're looking at right here on the histology shot is a section of the small intestine, and you can see the plicae circularis, these little upwellings that I mentioned right here. And then coming off the upwellings, you see the villi right in there. And here is an enlargement of the villi. So here's a picture of the villus, and here's a picture of the villus. And notice even on the villus, there are these more little guys sticking up. You don't see them right over here, but these are microvilli, and they are to increase surface area. So on the edges of the cells, so I'm drawing a cell right there, and that would be one of these cells. Remember, simple columnar. There are little extensions of the plasma membrane. Those are microvilli. Remember, they're not cilia. They don't beat. They're not for moving food along. They're for increasing surface area. Okay, good views of some things here. Mucus layer in dark purple. That's the mucosa. Submucosa, light pink, muscle layer, darker pink, and you can't quite see it, but out here would be the serosa. Alright, so let's go into more detail here. Alright, you see over on this villus to the right, a little capillary network inside of the mucosa and the uprising of the villus. You also see a yellow thing inside of it. That's a lacteal. Keep that in mind. It'll come up later. It's part of the lymphatic system, and fats are going to go into that. Glands. There are a lot of glands in the intestine. Noticed right there's an intestinal crypt. They're sometimes called the crypts of Lieberkühn. And they dip way down into the mucosa right there, and that's where a lot of the secretions are coming from. You also have some glands called Brunner's glands in there in the wall over here. These glands make a lot of enzymes. You'll see them coming up in a minute. There's also some endocrine glands in the small intestine, and they make secretin and CCK, pancreasymin. You'll see those come up along the way. And of course there's also going to be some goblet cells, and they're making mucus. I mentioned the lacteal in the lymphatic tissue, but let me point also out something else. In the particularly in the jejunum, and even more so in the ileum, you have, look at this picture right down over here, you have in the submucosa, that's submucosa right down in here, some clusters of dark blue tissue right in here. These are called Peyer's patches. They are lymphatic. They are basically like tonsils and lymph nodes. A lot of phagocytic cells, a lot of T cells and B cells, and very important in immunity. Before we leave this page, one last thing. Absorption. What's going on in the small intestine? Absorption of nutrients, absorption of water. Those are major things. So if you look down the little box at the middle bottom, you see 100% of the carbs are going to be absorbed. 90% of the protein, actually in the form of amino acids, and the carbs are going to be in the form of monosaccharides. The fats, less fatty acids and some fatty acids and some little chains of fatty acids and glycerol. And look at the water, 95% of water and ions. So this is the major absorption area. Okay, so good look in here at villi. There's a villus. Simple columnar. The nuclei of these cells are the dark purple. You can see some goblet cells. There's a good one right there, and there's another one right there. And again, remember, you can't see microvilli in a microscope. But if I were to take one of these cells, here's one of those simple columnar cells, and blow it up, remember that it's got microvilli up at the top. Good view of some intestinal glands right in here. Here's a good view of microvilli up there at the top of a simple columnar cell. So again, up at the top, you've got a view of where we are. Look at this area right in here. You're looking at about 21, 22 feet of small intestine. Now you're looking just at small. The large intestine is this big guy up here. Forget him for a while. Now you can't really see where the stomach comes in, but the stomach is sitting, up right in here, and the duodenum is going to come off here, and it's going to go down. Again, remember, it's only about a foot. And it then becomes the jejunum. This is the jejunum right there. And then at some point, at about 11 feet or so, no, 9, 10 feet, it changes over to the ileum. This is ileum, the longest portion. And then if you follow right here, here's the end of the ileum, follow my red, right there's the very end of the ileum. And this is where it goes into the large intestine. So right there is borderline. between ileum and cecum of the large intestine. Okay, so let's talk about the small intestine, and let me point out, I need to get a page here, blank page. I hope this works. I don't really use blank pages much. So let me remind you what's going on here. There's a stomach here. I'm not a very good drawer either. There's your valve, pyloric valve. Here's the intestine coming down here. And then, of course, we're going to move into the jejunum down there. All right, this is duodenum. Now, the food is going to come in this way, the chyme, and we now need to look at the duct coming from the gallbladder, and from the pancreas. And I haven't drawn this very well, but the pancreas is sitting underneath the stomach. In fact, you have to raise it. So I'm just going to kind of put it down here. Doesn't look like very much. I'll tell you what, let me change over to blue. So here's the pancreas right in here. And here it is behind the stomach. I'm making little dotted lines. So most of the pancreas is behind. Okay, and there's a duct coming from the pancreas. Again, I'm not drawing this very well. But that duct would come in right here, and the two ducts, one, that's pancreatic duct right there, and this is the common bile duct carrying bile over. So the duodenum is a mixing vat for the fluids from pancreas and the gallbladder, the bile. So pancreatic enzymes actually hit the food right in here, and then that stuff goes down towards the jejunum, where the small intestinal enzymes now pick up the digestion. So I'm going to talk about the enzymes from the small intestine in a second, but I want you to really understand that pancreatic enzymes actually hit the chyme first, and then the small intestinal enzymes hit it second. Okay, so let me get out of this page and go back to, that worked, nice. Okay, so we're going to jump down to the small intestine and look right here at brush border. Okay, so remember the microvilli, right? You see it right there. Notice it's kind of fuzzy right in here. Okay, right in here are where the small intestinal enzymes are. They are sitting right here above the microvilli. By the way, the other term for microvilli? Brush border. So intestinal enzymes are attached to the microvilli. They're not just out and about over here in the lumen. They're actually kind of stuck right here in the microvilli. All right, now the enzymes. Protein digesting enzymes, dipeptidase. Pept, remember, protein. Enterokinase, we'll talk about later, that activates pancreatic enzymes. Carb digesting enzymes, disaccharidases. Again, we're going to talk more about this later. These obviously break down disaccharides. There is also a hormone coming from the small intestine. It is called enterocrinin. I may run out of room there. And enterocrinin is a hormone, and when it is produced, it causes the intestine, small intestine, to make more mucosal material, which has more pH buffer, slightly basic, so that neutralizes the chyme coming from the stomach. Remember, it's going to be very acidic. By the way, these enzymes need to work in a more basic environment. They don't work well in acidity. Okay, control of the stuff moving from the small intestine. Local reflexes, again, as the food gets in, it causes expansion. It stimulates the baroreceptors, and that feeds information back to the brain to increase peristaltic action, and locally it promotes smooth muscle contraction. Also an enzyme, a hormone, called CPK-PZ. We'll talk more about it coming up, and it also promotes peristaltic action. Okay, so, oh, there's a good picture, better than my drawing. Alright, so let me pull this guy up. Okay, so remember on my very bad drawing, there's the gallbladder. This is the common bile duct coming down this way. This is the liver up in here. And it's got bile coming down too, but there's the common bile duct right there. And here is the pancreas tucked into the duodenum. There's a little U-turn of the duodenum before it goes down this way, down to the jejunum. And there's the pancreatic duct right there. There's a couple of them very often. And these two guys come together, and this is controlled by a little muscle that opens and closes to come into the small intestine. Alright, pancreas, you're looking at it right there. Islets of Langerhans, where insulin and glucagon come from. We do not care about that. Forget that. We'll pick it up in metabolism. What you care about right now are these cells out here. These cells around the islets. You can see they look different. If you could see them in more detail, you could see, I'm going to blow one up right here. It's got dark pink little granules. There's a nucleus right there. And these guys are called zymogen granules. And they are exocrine. These are all exocrine glands. And they produce the enzymes of the pancreas to break down food groups. So we are interested in exocrine glands now, the acinar cells, or plural acini. And they're the ones that contribute to pancreatic juice. Okay, hormonal controls over pancreatic enzymes. 2 hormones. These come from the small intestine. Secretin is going to direct the pancreas to make more pH buffer. And that pH buffer, and you've heard about it already, is bicarbonate, HCO3, bicarb. Remember, it's slightly alkaline. And it neutralizes the acidic chyme. And the more acidic the chyme is, the more that stuff will be made. Second hormone is CCK-PZ, and I haven't told you what that stands for. It's an acronym, obviously. CCK stands for cholecystokinin, and I'll talk more about that. But the PZ stands for pancreozymin, P and the Z, and it's named that because of its effect on the pancreas. It tells the pancreas to make more of those pancreatic enzymes for breaking down proteins and carbs and lipids. So the more fatty the food is, and the more protein the food has, the more enzymes you need, and that's the hormone that tells the pancreas to make those. Okay, moving along into this juice more. You're looking at over 1 liter a day. By the way, really good view of acinar cells and those little pink granules that I drew. Okay, here are the 3 enzymes. Three food groups that are broken down the enzymes. Protein group. Pancreatic enzymes, really important for protein breakdown. Look at all of them. They're made in an inactive state. You can see inogen, trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, carboxypeptidase, doesn't have an inogen but also inactive. Remember, they're made inactive so that the pancreas doesn't digest itself. They are activated by an enzyme from the small intestine called enterokinase. I think I mentioned it earlier. It's in your notes too. Don't confuse it with enterocrinin. An enterokinase is an enzyme, as you can tell from its word, and it splits off this side chain, and it activates the protein enzymes. And trypsin then activates chymotrypsinogen to chymotrypsin. Now you also see a lipid digesting enzyme, and this is the main boy right there. Remember I mentioned lingual lipase in the mouth and gastric lipase in the stomach, and I said they're pretty inconsequential. There's the main boy. We'll talk about him more later. He's breaking down lipids. Carbs, pancreatic amylase. Remember, amyl, starch. So more starches, big molecules of carbs get broken down that didn't get broken down in your mouth. Pancreatitis, rather obvious. And we've talked about sodium bicarb. There's nothing more to say on that.